Mythos is the Greek word for story of the people, and logos stands for word or speech. Myth or mythology is the spoken story of a people and has played an integral part in every civilization throughout the world. Prehistoric cave paintings, etchings in stone, tombs and monuments all suggested that long before human beings set down their myth in words, they had already developed a belief structure corresponding to the definition of myth. Studying mythology is the interpretation of traditional and sacred tales of a culture known as myths, or the collection of such stories, which deal with various aspects of the human condition. For instance, good and evil, the origin of place names, animals, cultural values, and traditions, but also the meaning of life and death, the afterlife, and the gods, or a god. Myths. They express the beliefs and values about these subjects held by a certain culture. So, what one calls mythology in the present day was the religion of the ancient past. But what is the truth behind these ancient stories? I am your host, Maria Anna van Driel, and you are listening to The Next Truth, where science and myth meet. Our guest this week is located at the moment in rural Alaska. So bear with me as I'm going to try to set up the connection with anthropologist Tok Thompson, who is an associate professor at the University of Southern California, and speak with him about what the relation of mythology is to religion, to science, popular culture, and did they really happen? Professor Thompson, welcome to the show of The Next Truth, where science and myth meet. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being on your show here. I just a little update. I just got promoted to full professor, so I am no longer associate professor. That's very recent. And then now I am back up in Alaska.
Promoted to full professor. Wow, congratulations. That's really great news. You're saying you are in rural Alaska at the moment. A silly question perhaps, but as we are speaking through audio only, can you describe the settings? I mean, what is it that you looking at? What is it that you're seeing when you are thinking about writing an article or you're conducting your research? Because I can imagine that the view must be amazing.
Oh, it's which is very beautiful here. It is at the moment the sun is shining, but it's been a fair amount of water. It's been kind of a cool summer, so it's kind of like the good old days. The life here seems to really be thriving this summer. So it's good to see. We've had many years that were simply too hot up here due to global warming. Right now, I'm looking over our a lake in rural Alaska, where more or less I grew up, watching the animals and getting to know the different animals and animal families that are around at the moment. So it's a good place to come and think and do things with my hands for a while.
You being born and raised in Alaska, how did you, at the age of 17, end up studying at Harvard College, where you received a bachelor degree in anthropology?
At the age of 17, I did well in school. I did well on standardized tests, and I applied to Harvard. And to my great surprise, I got in. And then I decided that perhaps I should go. I had no idea what I wanted to study. I drifted from philosophy to music and history, and then I finally discovered anthropology. And that was once I discovered anthropology, I realized that's what I wanted to study. I love learning about other ways of thinking about the world, other cultures, other languages, other religions, other philosophies. And this is continues with me to this very day. I'm always fascinated by all the different groups, all the different cultures.
Um, Hearing the term anthropology, I have to think about, well, how people lived, and maybe perhaps there is a little bit of archaeology in there. But what is anthropology, and what is it that influenced you to step in this field of research?
Well, anthropology is the logos of anthropos, the study of humankind. So it's kind of a broad topic. And the nice thing about it is that you really can study any group anywhere over the world, or different groups in different parts of the world. And as long as you're studying anything with the human condition, you can study this in an anthropological lens. And so the nice thing is too that it's very easy, I think, for people coming from a home culture, the particular national culture, or even just Western culture in general, to be less aware of how life can work differently. And very often, uh, people in a culture may think that their way is natural, or just the way that it has to be done. But when you understand the different cultures think about things and do things differently and construct their lives differently, you realize the possibilities that are there for yourself as an individual, and collectively all of us as a society. We all gain by becoming aware of human potential, and the realm of human potential is revealed through anthropology. And I had great anthropology professors at Harvard, and I just really loved the topic. And then I took some time off after that, and I was a musician for a while, traveling musician in a rock band. And when I went back to grad school, I was influenced to go to folklore studies, studying folklore at Berkeley. And I was interested in folklore very much. I had traveled in Ireland a little bit, and that was really piqued my curiosity in folklore. And I'd always been interested in folklore, the idea of what is not sort of official knowledge, legends that might be true, or all of this sort of stuff. So I was very interested in my anthropological lens of looking at cultural expressions, the stories people tell, the songs people sing when they're together, the way people bring their cultures to life, to aesthetics, to life. And what makes life fun for and beautiful for different people. This is something that I can really see in the folklore. So I went to Berkeley in a folklore master's program, which was the sum total of the folklore program at the time. And I studied under the late great Alan Dundes, who was a tremendous influence in me, and just a complete mentor. And I really, really, within 2 weeks of being in his graduate seminar, I think I had realized I was dedicating the rest of my life to academia, and most probably folklore studies. And that's still what I do. So on the one hand, and then I went on to a PhD in anthropology at UC Berkeley. But Alan Dundes was a professor of anthropology as well as folklore, and so I still sort of under his mentorship through my PhD there, working on especially folklore studies. So I'm a folklorist, but I'm also an anthropologist. I have sort of a foot in both worlds. I Some folklorists only study the folklore of their own culture or their own country, where I am an anthropological folklorist in the sense that I'm interested in folklore from all over the world, or from everywhere and anywhere. And yet I am a folklorist because, in the sense that that is what I like to study. Anthropologists study all sorts of different things. What I like to study is expressive culture. And Alan Dundes was a great mentor in how to do research, and sort of the fearless and rigorous approach to scholarship. So he was an enormous influence on me about what it takes to do good work, and what it takes to be a good lecturer, what it takes to be a good researcher, and to put this all together, be a good writer, and to always try to think about the theory. Where are we going with this? What do we mean when we say folklore? What do we mean when we say us very often? So to push the theoretical bounds, and to look at folklore not just as something cute to be looked at, but something to be analyzed, something to be thought about, something to be subjected to as much scholarly scrutiny as possible.
Now I'm wondering, how do you research mythological tales from the past?
Mythological tales. So I've developed. I've always had a strong interest in mythology, and over the course of my career in folklore studies, I started working more and more with mythology and myths in general. So folklore study all sorts of different things. There's a lot of people that really focus on legends. A lot of people focus on perhaps tales, fairy tales. Some people proverbs or folk music. For me, I've sort of been drifting heavily towards mythology. And because I find mythology to be very often sort of at the core of a culture. What I mean by that is if I'm trying to understand a different culture, and their strange practices, or the way they do funerals or the way they get married or whatever, very often the sort of most central thing I want to know is what are their myths? Where do they say how the world was created? Where they were created? How did their life come to be in these sacred stories? And so for me, mythology was a great way of trying to understand, I guess, different worldviews and different cultures. You've got mythological tales that are very, very current, now. And then you've also got, we have historical accounts of mythology, like classical Greek mythology or classical Norse mythology. But you've also got a lot of mythology that's very, very contemporary, both very traditional mythologies in various peoples around the world, including like some Native American groups, as well as sort of newly emergent mythologies, that new stories that people are telling about what created the world, such as a very prominent one in the United States anyway, is this idea that the world or people or our way of life somehow was created by extraterrestrial aliens. In fact, extraterrestrial alien belief is huge in the United States. Recently, a set of statistics suggested that more people in the United States believe that aliens have come down and in some way helped create our world. More people believe this than believe Jesus Christ was the Son of God. America tends to be a very Christian nation. Most Americans do believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, but even more believe that aliens also helped shape the world that we now live in. So just looking at those statistics, you got stuff from the past. They're both about the past, right? How the world was created in a sense, or what happened in the distant past. But they're also somewhat congruent in the sense that obviously a lot of people, looking at the statistics, a lot of people in America believe both. Mythology can be studied at a certain point in time, like what was ancient Aztec mythology, but can also be studied now, even in terms of very traditional creation stories or traditional myths, again, Native American or something like that, versus sort of emergent myths like, ancient aliens created our world.
There is a purpose for these ancient, sacred, and cultural tales being told back then, and of course today. But what is the purpose of telling these tales over time?
So I think that mythology tends to function the same in every culture, and I think people are very often unaware of how mythology shapes their world because what mythology does is it sort of sets up what is natural or what the world is or what sort of category. So they're stories, usually creation stories of how the world that we now live in came to be. And so again, these are pretty widely shared in Western culture. We have the Abrahamic myth, certainly the Garden of Eden, that many people maybe believe literally, or many people believe figuratively. Perhaps some people believe not at all. But no matter if you don't even believe in the Garden of Eden story, it still suffuses our culture. It. It creates categories. All right, the Adam's apple for men, right? The part of your biology. Whether or not you believe in the mythology, it's still a part of our culture. So I think that you can analyze all mythologies comparatively and see the sort of categories that they suggest, see what sort of ways that they say the world is. And again, this is what myths do. They take they take our culture and they make our culture seem natural.
Not only are you a professor teaching and researching mythology and anthropology, you are also an author. and one of your books is titled The Truth of Myth. Well, what is a myth, and how is this related to science?
So this is the idea of the truth of myth, right? This is the recent book that I co-authored with Greg Schremp. It's meant to be sort of an overview of the study of mythology, and as well as an introduction, and hopefully something that could be used in universities, as well as people just wanted to know, what is myth and how do scholars study it. Um, so one of the parts, this is a real specialty too of my co-author Gregory Schrump, and he has a couple of books on this topic, particularly about the relationship between myth and science. And so very often people get these sort of things put into a binary, as if these things are opposites, that, science replaces myth, because we used to have, the Garden of Eden, and now we have the Big Bang. But I think that's a false dichotomy, and because they're just very different discourses. Science is good at saying what happened, right? Okay, there was a Big Bang. But science doesn't really give any personal meaning to an individual. If you ask your, astronomy professor, why the Big Bang happened, there's no why, right? Or why am I here? Or, what am I supposed to do? What is it to be a good person? These are not in the realm of science to answer. And yet, this is what myths do. So, on the one hand, they tell us how the world was created, now either literally or symbolically. But the important thing is, I think, the symbolism. The symbolism that the apple is the fruit of knowledge, right? This is built into our culture. It's reflected in many ways. The idea of our sexuality, of how sexuality is constructed, how men and women became sexual, and how that's best enacted. Right, we have that set up in the creation story of Adam and Eve when they eat the apple and they realize their nakedness. So these sort of things address different issues than simply what happened. Right. So again, I think science and mythology are very, very different discourses. I would say that science is influenced by mythology. And what I mean by that is that scientists are people, and as people, they are members of a culture, and as members of a culture, they are influenced by their culture's mythology. And therefore, the sorts of questions they might ask about the world, the sorts of categories they might want to go into their scientific inquiry with, might actually be influenced by those mythological categories. And so, for example, evolution, right? So this seemed to work against the creation story in the Garden of Eden, and to the point where I believe most Americans do not believe in biological evolution, because this goes against, presumably, the creation story in the Bible. Right, so we could see that even this notion of science can be influenced by the mythology, because Charles Darwin, it was a big deal, and it was a contentious scientific issue, and yet if you look at sort of Native American mythologies, by contrast, most of their mythologies have animals sort of creating the world and creating people, and so it's very clear that sort of we came from animals, or the animals were here before us, I guess I should say. And that they help sort of create the world that we live in and who we are. So there are different mythologies, right? These are not scientific stories, but some of them are more congruent with science than others. And so science and mythology are not binary opposites. They are not necessarily opposed. My co-author in The Truth of Myth, Greg Schemp, has a couple of fantastic books out about the relationship of popular science writers, science magazines and things, to mythology and their sort of relationship. And he sort of says that very often they sort of proclaim that they are displacing myth and giving, science instead, and sort of that they are oracles of truth rather than the mythologist. And yet he notes that they very often sort of try to invoke mythology and try to give our life meaning. And so some really fascinating work, too, about how science is conveyed or understood by the general public. So popular science isn't quite the same as sort of, scholarly science. And yet they both are a part of our cultural discourse, as is myth.
Now, we have heard the terms anthropology and mythology dozens of times, but what is the difference between anthropology and mythology?
Well, myth and mythology, they tend to be used a lot, almost as co-equals, but mythology is the logos of myth, the meaning of myth. So the idea of mythology very often is the study of myth, or trying to understand the sense of myth. So myth, I think at the most basic level, the most useful definition of the word that we try to employ in the book is this idea of a profound narrative. So there's a story, all right? There's a story, or even broader, a narrative in the sense it could be a play, it could be a ritual, but a sequence of events portrayed as a narrative that is taken as profound or even sacred significance. And I think many, many times these myths are, in a sense, creation stories of how our world was created, how the world was created, how maybe the land was created, maybe how our people were created, how our nation was created. So this idea is of background stories that give our lives as individuals meaning, that people draw a lot of meaning from, give meaning to life. So this is what myths do. This is how people employ them. But myths are tremendously powerful, again, in the way that the statements that they sort of carry across about what is sacred to life, or what is life about, or how to be a good person, or what are the categories, right? How many genders, or all these sorts of things.
Now, another book that you have written bears the title Posthuman Folklore. On the cover, there is a UFO pictured and a robot. But how are UFOs and artificial intelligence, for instance, related to mythology? How are these, well, advanced technologies, as we have become to understand it, related to these sacred tales?
Right. So posthuman folklore. Right. I already mentioned the idea of people believing in extraterrestrial aliens coming down and helping to shape the world. And so posthumanism is something I've been very, very interested in too. And there's particularly interesting combinations one can do with mythological studies as well as sort of posthumanism. So just real briefly to go over posthumanism. Posthumanism is a really important and I think exciting philosophical corrective that is sort of sweeping the academy at this point. So many, many disciplines, if not all disciplines, are wrestling with the impacts of posthumanism. And posthumanism is about really questioning what it is to be human. What are you when we're human, right? What do we make those distinctions? We used to be very, when I was growing up, it was man the tool user. Well, that's no longer valid. Chimpanzees use tools. And then it was man the tool maker. Well, okay, chimpanzees make tools, and then, crows make tools, and we got fish making tools, right? So all of these things that used to sort of set us apart are a little bit more difficult to maintain. The idea of culture, it used to be only humans had culture and animals were acting from instinct. Well, we know it's not true now. We know that animals have culture, they have communication, they have social traditions. There's a very, very rich world in the animal kingdom. And don't even get me started about the plant kingdom, because we're realizing so much more about memory and information and communication that goes on throughout the web of life. So this idea that we thought we were alone in this and has been overturned by some remarkable developments, particularly in the realm of ethology, the study of animal behavior. So suddenly, if you go to animal behavior books, all these animal behavior scientific journals are talking about words like tradition and culture and things that we used to assume were for humans alone. So what is it to be human? And now we realize even genetically we've got other species, we've got Denisovan, we have Neanderthal, right? We have, so what is it to be human? So that's one issue, and the ways that people, I think, are dealing with what has been called the animal turn. And again, for me, with my interest in Native American traditions and Native American mythology and folklore, uh, this posthumanism thing, the animal turn, is an old story. It's already built into Native American culture. So it's sort of interesting what is seen as this fresh, interesting, scientifically led revolution in the way that we think in the academy has long been sort of accepted and known and accepted in some indigenous communities. So I think, post-colonialism, I think that we can learn from indigenous communities. I think we can learn a great deal from different mythologies, from different ways of thinking about life. and that these can really help inform our scientific inquiries into ethology and things like that. So that's one huge aspect of posthumanism is when you play games with your dog, who's leading it? Is it just you training your dog, or is your dog kind of helping to train you somewhat? So if you're studying culture, to what degree is our culture just located in us, and to what degree do traditions and language and songs and dance can be studied transspecially rather than in one species that is our own alone? So the animal turn is very, very interesting. It's being led by ethology, but it has remarkable repercussions for all of sort of, the humanities, which are labeled the humanities, or anthropology, which again is all about man. It's supposed to be the study of culture, but now we know that other things have culture too. Again, it has a great impact in all sorts of different disciplines. The other branch of posthumanism that is also really growing really quickly is this idea of artificial intelligence, or sort of us melded with the machine, cyborg intelligence, the rise of internet identity, people identifying with their online personas or their avatars. So there's this idea here too that that we do have artificial intelligences that people talk to. You have chatbots that you might interact with. People are building androids and have been for 20 some years, perhaps starting from really the first commercial one of the Aibo, the robotic android dog in Japan. And so in Japan now, these Aibos they stopped making the spare parts, they've stopped repairing them, and so Aibos are dying, you might say. They're finally breaking down, and many Japanese families, these androids have been increasingly involved members of their family, learning all their little different traditions and habits and names and all of this sort of stuff. And so they're giving these Aibos funerals, like full religious Shinto funeral, praying for their soul in the afterlife. So ethics, right? What are the ethics of androids? Can you have an android slave? Can you beat an android? Or what about, can androids commit crimes? Right? If you get hit by a driverless car working on AI, who's liable? So this has a tremendous amount of implications in computer technology, in ethics, in legal studies. So all of this sort of stuff is coming together. And again, this is all being very challenged by a lot of our core mythologies. And as I suggested, it's creating new mythologies. So now we're looking out towards ancient aliens, right? Or this idea that perhaps we're not really from Earth. We're not Earthlings. Maybe we're star children. So these are very often being combined with Abrahamic mythologies, or sometimes other mythologies. If you remember the big Mayan calendar a couple of years ago, was it 2012? Right, the world was supposed to end, and it was the Mayan calendar, and yet a lot of very religious Christian people were relying now on the Mayan calendar as well as UFO belief to have this particular belief of a particular end of the world. So all of these are sort of working at all times. So what I'm suggesting is mythology is a constant part of culture, and perhaps it's at its most powerful when people don't realize that they're being influenced by it. Right? If they say, "Oh no, I'm scientific. I'm not influenced by any sort of mythology," well, that's when mythology has its grip on you, right? Because then you're not aware of all the things that it is making seem natural that are culturally constructed.
When I'm listening to you, a question pops up in my mind about how real are these ancient stories? I mean, do they have a real life occurrence?
Could be, right? Without a time machine, how would you know? One thing you do understand when you start studying mythology is that historically, in this sense, is that catastrophic events are very often interpreted through the lens of the culture's mythology, and then these events can help shape that mythology. Right? Mythology is an ongoing story in the sense. And very often events are ongoing events. So speaking of the flood, there are many flood myths throughout the world. There's not one flood myth, and not all cultures have flood myths. So it's very important to realize that there is no flood myth. All right, there's many flood myths in many cultures, and if you study these cross-culturally, you realize that they occur frequently in people in floodplains, right? Places that flood tend to have flood myths, and there's some great studies in the northwest coast of the United States of the flood myths of many of the indigenous groups in several different language families up in the realm of the Cascadia subduction zone, which is very prone to earthquakes and tsunamis and catastrophic flooding. And so these have been reworked into the mythology of these peoples. It is caused by mountain dwarves, the sort of the spirits of the mountains dancing. The mountain dwarves dance very often when they are angry at people for violating some taboo or committing some grievance. So it also sort of sets out, what happens. So in other words, when the earthquakes happen, then they send the flood. So that myth is fascinating for a number of reasons. It's not at all the same flood myth that we have from Abrahamic zones. So again, it's not one flood myth, two different cultures, two different myths. But again, these guys are in a flood area that is flooded. We know this from geology and even some history. It floods at sort of regular bases, and the floods can be catastrophic for people living on the coast, right? Fishing for the most part. So these are very frequently incorporated into the myths. So it's almost a chicken and egg question, right? Did the myth because of one flood, but in a sense it keeps going because the floods keep happening. And again, this goes into their theater, their rituals. They do theatrical mythic performances of the mountain dwarfs dancing. It helps sustain their cultural system of ethics and morality, because when people do immoral things or do unethical things, that's when the mountain dwarfs dance and cause devastation. So keep people on the straight and narrow, if you will. And it also reminds people that, look, when there's an earthquake, there's going to be a flood coming. So you better head to high water or get on a boat or something. So it also conveys very practical information. And it can do this over hundreds of years. There might be hundreds of years when there hasn't been, an earthquake and a flood. But these stories, these narratives can help that very important pragmatic information keep going. So floods work on all these levels. They create the toponyms of what a place may be called. They explain why things happen, why catastrophes happen. They warn what to do in the future. They can sort of contain, versions of history. But again, like comparing myth is not science, myth is also not history. All right, and that's an important distinction. History is a different discipline. It's a different thing. It's trying to find out what actually happened, and did this happen, did this not happen? That's not really what myths are about. Myths are about, like, why, right? Why did this happen? Why is the world the way it is? Events, even huge events like, say, a meteor explosion or an earthquake or a tsunami, in mythology would very often be remembered in terms of their, cultural significance, in terms of their significance to the mythology, to the ethical system, these sorts of things. So yes, tremendous events can work their way into mythology, but that's not the point of mythology in a sense. The point of mythology is to make sense of the world, to give meaning to the world. Now, there's the other category, legends, right? Legends are something that a lot of folklorists also study, but legends are about, what really happened. Right? So if it's more of a literal thing. So, was King Arthur a real person? Well, we don't know, but it could have been, right? So it's a legend. So for some people, or Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, right? This tends to be a legend. It's a question of factual truth. So for some people, aliens coming down to Earth may be a question of factual truth. In other words, it might be a legend. Wow, I think I saw, or my buddy saw a UFO land. And yet for other people, clearly these same narratives or related narratives are taken as helping to create our world, give meaning, give shape to our identity, that we're, part star children or whatnot.
Reading into the prologue, you mentioned that your personal views have been influenced by not only Western science, but also by your own growing up in the backwoods of Alaska, where wild animals frequently interact with your family world. Do I have to think in this of wild animals seeking a form of connection with humans in a similar manner as in, for instance, the tales told by Native American Indians?
Right. So in my prologue to the book, Posthuman Folklore, I did try to, give an account for who I was, this reflective sort of turn. And it's not central to the book, I don't think, but some people might be interested of how I came to develop these interests and these views, and let the reader be aware of any potential biases I might have by saying, look, this is my own personal situation. And then reflectively, yes, my views on posthumanism, my interest in Native American mythology, my concern about the environmental crisis we're in, which all sort of combine. And these have been very, very shaped by how I grew up. My interest in anthropology has been very shaped by how I grew up. I grew up, for the most part, in the woods. My dad was a bit of a survivalist. Until I was 4 years old, we lived in a small native village, and then oil was discovered nearby, and that village was being replaced by a small sort of oil town. And at that point, my dad said it's too crowded, and we moved pretty much out into the wilderness. And by the time I was four, and that's where I grew up. And so my world wasn't really around other people much. My folks were busy, and I was me and my brother were left to sort of run around the wilderness at our will, at our leisure. And it was a great place to be. We had wild, unhabituated animals. This was not even a place that they were used to people. We were clearly the new guys in the neighborhood. And so I learned to identify the different animals as neighbors, as individuals, right? So it's not just, oh, there's, that bear. It's like, oh, or it's not just a bear. It's like, oh, yeah, there's that bear. She's sort of shy, there's that old, eagle. Boy, he got a bad temper. And so you got to know these people, well, the animals that lived around here as individuals, and got to interact with them as individuals. And so, by the time I went to Harvard, we weren't really allowed to talk about animals having thoughts or personalities or mentalities, and they were all supposed to be acting from instinct, and it just really didn't jive with my understanding that what I had experienced. I had experienced a lot of, very intelligent animals, and I had seen their thought processes. My dad got both me and my brother sort of wolf dogs, wolf hybrids. They were half wolf and half dog, and they were pretty wolfy, frankly. And so we go, when I was a teenager, start running around with them. So I had a very sort of, I guess you might say, post-human upbringing. I hung out with wild animals as my neighbors, and I was always then, I never really found that explained in the Western discourse at the time, but where I did find it explained was in the Native American discourse. And, the area I grew up was predominantly Native American. I'm not Native American myself, but my first name is, and I, grew up with Native American people in my family, and Native American babysitters, Native American friends, with Native American community. And I kind of gravitated towards that. And especially once I started becoming more and more interested in anthropology, I started reading up more on and trying to absorb more from my home culture in Alaska. So, my family's been tremendously influenced and intermarried and whatnot with the local natives group here, the Denaitna group particularly. But there's also a lot of other natives that live now in town. And my older brother's wife for many years was a Yupik Eskimo. So this is, it's been a part of my culture. I would say, growing up, has always been very, very influenced by the local Native American culture in all sorts of ways, like even the food we eat and what we do for a living, and commercial fishing and all of this sorts of things. So. So this is just sort of everyday life for me, I guess. And then culturally, I had this a window into this way of thinking about animals provided through the Native American mythology and the Native American stories. And again, I really tried to absorb and focus on those from my home area. That's what I grew up with. And I've also tried to really work on the local language here, which is a critically endangered language, and it's just an absolutely fascinating grammatically incredibly complex and elegant language. It's a Athabascan or Dene language, Denaina. And it's kind of on its last legs. There's only about certainly less than 40 fluent speakers left in the world, and so I'm trying to learn it, and some other local people are trying to learn it as well. And we're trying to help revitalize that language. And so that's another interest of mine too, is native languages, because mythology and these worldviews and cultures are very, very often lodged in languages. So you can't just rely on translations. If you want to really understand something, you have to learn that language, right? When I was studying Irish mythology and learning and living in Ireland, I learned Irish, and now I'm pretty darn fluent in Irish. So similarly, language for me is sort of an essential thing for an anthropologist and folklorist and mythologist to try to get one's head around, because language is not just a different way of saying the same thing. It opens up these categories. There's a very, very interesting link between mythology and language. And so you can see this very often by studying other languages and other mythologies. And for me, that's particularly been Native American and particularly Dena'ina.
Now, as you briefly mentioned to me in one of your emails, you're currently working on Native American mythology and how they play a role in today's thinking and perhaps daily activities from people. Does your childhood experiences with the wildlife of Alaska influence your research in Native American mythology?
Yes, I've been lecturing on Native American mythology for 14, 15 years now. And I've been working on, right now I'm working on an overview chapter for a Cambridge edition on Native American mythology. So this is, again, a long-standing interest of mine, and again, relates to my upbringing.
Well, listening to the tales told and reading certain tales, creatures like Deer Woman and the Wendigo and shapeshifters do come to mind when I hear the term Native American mythology. How close do you think that our modern understanding of the paranormal is to these ancient creatures? And why do you think that that is?
Okay, so Wendigo shapeshifters, sure. This idea of shapeshifters is found in many Native American cultures. It's found in other places around the world too. There's a particular, I would say that the real sort of core of the issue, uh, I think, for a lot of Native American mythology is the stories of the creation of the world, the creation of people, this sort of how the world was created. And in these stories, very, very frequently, there's sort of Garden of Eden time, if you will, the time before our world. Animals and people talk the same language and live similar lives. So animals frequently appear like people in these stories. They paddle canoes, or they live in teepees, or they build lodges, or whatever the case may be. And these very often sort of set up the world that we live in. And so the other sort of big stories that you find too are stories about connections between those two worlds. So one very, very frequent theme is an individual who gets taken into another species, right? During the Haida, who in the Northwest Coast rely on salmon. There's a great story called Salmon Boy, where a young Haida man, before the Haida knew what salmon were for the Haida, how they should treat them, this boy was sort of abducted, if you will, or kidnapped or taken home by the salmon people and lived among them, and then returns to his people, transforms again out of a salmon back into a human, and then tells the people how that relationship should be. The Gwich'in, the Athabascan Gwich'in group in northern Alaska and Canada, have a very similar story about the caribou, where you have a man who becomes a caribou and lives with the caribou, marries caribou, sometimes has caribou children, but at some point comes back to the human community and says, "Look, this is our relationship here." So the slippage between the shape shifting works a little differently, I guess I would say. It's much more of a sort of a sacred aspect to shape shifting. But it's also, again, you have legends about shape shifting. You have shape shifting creatures that are said to be true, that are more legends, much like Loch Ness monster or something, or Bigfoot. Bigfoot actually is a Native American uh, um, creature, that Sasquatch, that has been taken into a popular American one. So the idea of the slippage between the human and the animal realms is just an overarching theme of Native American mythology. And it really sets up their ethical systems, their categories of what is, again, to be people. Most Native American worldviews, do animals have souls? Yes. And that's exactly the opposite from the Abrahamic worldview. In the Abrahamic worldview, animals do not have souls. And for so long, Western science said animals do not have culture, animals do not have, mentalities. Native American culture for so long, their mythology said animals have souls, animals have spirits, and therefore, of course, they have cultures, mentalities. And so that allows also Native American cultures to prescribe ways, ethical ways, pragmatic and ethical ways for interspecial relations. So it's not simply one of domination. Oh, we can go do this to them. Rather, it's like, well, how should we ethically treat the salmon? How should we ethically treat the caribou? While we harvest them, while we live off of them. So this is a very different way of thinking about the world. And for me, it also has a tremendous amount of importance in terms of how to rethink perhaps humankind's relationship to the environment. Because, again, one of the most critical issues that humanity in the world is facing right now is global climate devastation. Anthropogenic, man-made global climate devastation, profound species loss, the sixth great extinction. I mean, life on Earth is dying. So obviously what we're doing, whatever sort of dominant culture thing we got going, isn't working in terms of sustainability, in terms of, creating a world that our grandchildren could thrive in. So my firm belief is that we can learn from looking at cultures that do know how to be sustainable, that do build that into their belief systems, to their sense of ethics, to their pragmatic and day-to-day interactions, as well as their most mythological and ritual and sacred interactions. So I think there's a great deal of wisdom to be gained from examining the mythologies, as well as, again, the sort of the cultural practices. And again, the one thing that I think humankind in general needs to figure out as soon as possible is how to change our culture, our worldview, to one that supports more of a sustainable, environmentally sustainable culture. And to get there, again, we can learn by looking at other mythologies and other ways of life.
When I was surfing the net, I came across one of your YouTube videos from 2015. And you mentioned that you have spent a lot of time in Ethiopia. What is it that made you travel to Ethiopia? And what was it that you have been studying while being there?
Oh, right. I did spend a lot of time in Ethiopia. When I was a grad student, I was living in Oakland, California, and I was living in Little Ethiopia. There were, I think I counted once 14 Ethiopian or Eritrean restaurants within a mile of my house. And I really enjoyed the food. I enjoyed the community. I enjoyed living in that neighborhood. And I met a gal. We became engaged. We got married. I got to know her family, and then that I also went back to Ethiopia, and I got to meet the major folklorist in Ethiopia, Professor Fakada Azeze, who does fantastic work in Ethiopian folklore. I was later brought in to teach a course as they were starting to get a PhD program opening up, and they were inviting sort of international professors. I went there and did a crash course for their graduate students, so I got to meet some of the fantastic up-and-coming folklorists in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is just a fantastically rich country in terms of the culture and the languages and the folklore and the traditions and the stories, and it's just it's a marvelous, marvelous place for a folklorist to work. So, I was interested. I did a little bit of work. I published one article on Ethiopian proverbs, but I also looked at a lot of sort of different folk religion practices and different mythic traditions. And again, there's so much to be done there. I honestly think that if a young folklorist came to me and said, "Look, I want to go do field work, get to some fresh terrain that hasn't been gone over too much. Where should I go?" I would say, "Have you thought about Ethiopia? There's so much work to be done there. Fantastic place to study."
Now, in that same video, you used the term internet folklore. This is the first time that I hear this term. So, what does it mean? How is it created? How are we being influenced by this?
Oh, internet folklore, sure, sure. Internet folklore is huge. So, again, what do I mean when I say folklore? It's the lore of the folk, right? So this is simply means the stuff you learn from other people. This is my easy definition of folklore. The stuff you learn from other people. Now, we very often think that folklore is the stuff of the dancing peasants view or the Brothers Grimm, and that was the folklore at the time. But of course, once the Grimms wrote it and printed it, it became frozen. That's sort of a record of the folklore of the time. Um, it became sort of literature, became written down. So folklore is just the stuff we tell each other. Um, the rumors, the legends, the proverbs, the jokes. This is all folklore. It's very different from authored literature. There's usually not an author attached. It changes, it mutates. It's hard to study, all right, because it's always changing. That story, every time you go back and you want to get that legend again about that haunted house, is different. So this is just that's what folklore means, and so a lot of this communication, a lot of these jokes, a lot of these legends, a lot of this sort of communication is taking place online. So the internet is a huge place for folklore at this point. I guess I should say that folklore is always created by people, and usually it's passed on. Right? I heard this joke, I heard this story. Well, when I was younger, here's what we used to do. And again, this is happening at an incredible pace online on internet. So the internet's a little bit different than folklore face to face, right? Because you have to be in the room to if you're going to go to a live folk dance and hear live folk music, you have to be in that room. It's not the same if it's podcasted or something. Um, the internet might freeze things, right? So you can go back and visit that recording, or you can read what that joke that guy sent. So it works a little different. The internet folklore can be very global. So jokes or legends or conspiracy theories, folk practices can spread over the internet globally very, very quickly now. So this is also different because a lot of people think of folklore as very national, right? Like, German folklore or Norwegian folklore or Ethiopian folklore. It never has been quite true in the sense that, we share so much of our folklore with so many different cultures. But the other thing I think that should be mentioned with that is that it's increasingly not true on the internet, where so many things on the internet are being um, bandied about globally, or diaspora. They can be in touch with the hometown still and keep up with all the news. And I would say that most of our culture in this day and age is done online, and it's actually done in a folkloric model, not in an authorial model, not with the old system of having newspapers, that one national newspaper that was a source of truth or something. So these are very, very different. But I would say increasingly our world is folklore because we're relying so much on the internet. So this pushes folklore to being, sort of, I think, central to understanding global culture today. Folklore used to be, before the printing press, it was, the old school and the dancing peasants. Well, since the internet, it's actually probably been at the forefront of culture in the world today. So sometimes I joke that I went into graduate school in folklore studies and what was considered an antiquated profession. And when I got out of school, it was considered a very cutting edge discipline. And the discipline didn't change. It was the same discipline, but the world changed. The internet happened, more or less, when I was in grad school. And so I think folklore had a tremendous role in people understanding global culture, global societies, global cultural expressions, all of this sort of stuff.
Now, here's a crazy idea. In a previous podcast, I spoke with Nottingham Trent University astronomer Dr. Daniel Brown. And I proposed a theory or an idea that some air shafts, which are built in the pyramids of Giza, could have contained natural crystals shaped into, well, lenses and have been aimed at particular stars for its light to enter and create a light spectacle in certain chambers. That could have been used during a burial or meditation rituals to invoke a god or gods. Do you think that some of the ancient Egyptian or Native American mythological tales could have a certain origin in such astrological events?
Well, I will say that astrological events are often remembered in mythological traditions. There's a lot of people that have turned their attentions to the skies. Maybe not so much in the tropical rainforest, you don't see the skies, but if you're out in the desert and you're away from sort of artificial lights, there's some it's huge. There's a lot of stars up there. They're interesting things, and they change and they move. And why, right? What is the sun? Why does it move? Why do we have 12.47 lunations per solar year? Why do we see these celestial planets? Right. So there have been many stories and people assigning some sort of symbolic or mythic quality to the cosmos, to the stars. And you see shooting stars, you see events. Sometimes comets come down and hit the Earth, right? And I've heard people suggest that the idea of the burning bush and was a meteorite that smashed, and this is where the Ark of the Covenant comes from. Right, so who knows? Certainly, we find that we know among ancient Egyptians and a lot of the ancient cultures on the Arabian Peninsula, again, it's a desert area, very finely attuned to celestial events. They would see comets and asteroids come down and hit the Earth, and meteors, and they had metal. We know that they have things that were harvested, metals harvested from meteors that show up as jewelry for some of the pharaohs in Egypt. So these things would have been, of course, if something comes down from the sky and smashes and blows things up, I'm sure people would have remembered that and said, "Wow, that's significant." Right? There must be some sort of significance. If you look at the Stonehenge and the Neolithic monuments that we see in the megalithic culture in Western Europe, and you definitely see astronomical alignments, right? They were not built to observe the stars. I don't think they already knew where to build these things, right? Where these celestial events would occur. So yes, I mean, major monuments are very often built in with attention paid to celestial alignments, celestial events. One great example of this is the Dogon culture, which is a very interesting non-Abrahamic religion, still in North Africa, in the Sahara. So the Dogon worshipped the star Sirius, who's a prominent deity in their traditions, and also Sirius is invisible to the naked eye twin star. So Sirius has an invisible twin. And so for a long time, they're like, how could the Dogon know about this when you can't see it except with modern telescopes? The answer seems to be that you used to be able to see it. I think a couple of thousand years ago, when some event happened and now no longer visible. So it's pretty clear that the Dogon, and they've worked this event and this relationship into their mythology, into their architecture, into their rituals. We're able to, record in a sense this celestial event, give it significance, and remember that the star Sirius has a rotating twin that you don't see with your naked eye.
Now, over time, the myths have changed or slightly adjusted to the ruling nation from that time. Do you think that there is perhaps a possibility that mythology will see, well, a new or another evolution. Now we are have been entering an era of technology and internet.
Yes, I think the internet era is definitely is already giving us a revolution, perhaps, in mythology. And again, the one I point to the most is this question of aliens. So this idea of extraterrestrial aliens and perhaps some kind of cosmic consciousness. And there's a lot of interesting ideas that are coming up. And I think, again, one of the things that happens with the internet, and it happened relatively fully and quickly, is that communication and therefore sort of culture became globalized. Right? Everybody around the world is doing the latest dance craze or the Harlem Shake or whatever. So these things are quickly sweeping the globe, and so the idea of thinking of oneself as a citizen of the world, as a global citizen, is rising. More and more people are identifying as citizens of the world rather than citizens of nation states. Again, the nation state was built on the printing press. It was built on national languages, national printing presses. It was built on geography that could, stop foreign material at the border. And I think that internet is really pushing this away. I think most people are now communicating globally and therefore thinking of themselves as global citizens. So this is changing culture on Earth. We're now thinking of ourselves as global citizens. But what is it to be, a global citizen? And who's not who's not a global citizen? Right? So aliens are interesting in the sense that they are sort of us but not us. Are they us? Are we part alien? Or are they? Why do they always kind of look vaguely humanoid, right? As if there are future selves, perhaps. Or why don't they look more like a bat or something, right? Or an amoeba. So this idea, and then you get other traditions where the aliens are clearly others. They are not us, and so then we all have to sort of band together, right? If aliens ever started sitting down attacking us with rocket ships, it wouldn't really matter if you're Israeli or Palestinian, right? All of a sudden, all people of Earth would be trying to save humanity. So they present, even as a narrative format, this interesting character of the non-Earthling, right? The sort of the shadow side to being an Earthling. We have to define through opposition. It's hard to think of yourself as a global citizen unless you can imagine somebody who's not, right? Who would be the enemy? Who would be the not us? And so aliens can perform this narrative function. And then for others, they perform other narrative functions. And so there's a great deal of new narratives, new stories, new beliefs that sort of spring out of this that, to my mind, seem very, very focused on this idea of being a global citizen, the globe. But then again, that goes back to the animal thing, right? What is to be an earthling? I guess it's any culture. And so that's kind of nice. You can go to anywhere in the world and you can talk to people about, what about aliens, right? So it doesn't really matter what religion you are, what ethnicity you are, what if aliens attacked us? And this is a conversation you can have, in any culture around the world now, in a sort of interesting, productive way. And then at the same time, well, sure, we're earthlings, okay, but, aren't whales earthlings? Right? Aren't wolves earthlings? Aren't amoebas earthlings? So it brings back that other side of that posthuman question. What is it to be an earthling? What is it to be biologically a part of the web of life on Earth? As I point out, we think of ourselves as different from trees. I'm a person, the tree's a plant, but we're in symbiosis, right? I breathe out carbon dioxide, the tree breathes in, and they bring out the oxygen that I breathe in, and so it's like they have my other lungs, right? They have half of my lungs, or half of my lungs are in them, you might say. So, I mean, you can't extract ourselves from this web of life. We can't, the idea of transhumanism, that we're going to sort of upload your consciousness to the internet, I think it's a false hope. I think it's a false hope as well as the space travel hope that we're going to jettison into the stars and form a new, better Earth somewhere else. I think these are all escapist fantasies. I think that what we need to do is increasingly realize our biological ontology. We are a part of the web of life, and we cannot escape that. And so I see a lot of escapism, though, also in the internet, this idea that we can be real there. Well, not really, because you still have that biological side of you that needs to be fed, that needs to be stimulated, that needs to be taken care of. We are a part of the web of life, and so I think it's kind of dangerous to pretend that we are not.
As I have briefly mentioned your books, um, what holds the future for your career as an author? Can we expect a new book from you?
Well, right now I've got several ideas. I'm finishing up a couple of overdue projects that should be out soon. So once I get a couple of overdue projects out, I can sort of cast about with some new ideas. And I've been working on several projects, the last couple of books and a few other ones for such a long period of time that it's sort of a wonderful spot to be in, where I'm actually being able to think about what I want to do on a more sustained sort of book level next. And I'm honestly not sure right now. So I've got my hands in a few smaller research projects, and then I'm continuing to edit, along with Gregory Schremp, the series on mythology from around the world uh, by Oxford University Press. The series is called World Mythologies in Theory and Everyday Life. We already have one on ancient Greek mythology. We've got one on Norse mythology coming out, and we hope to roll out with a series of worldwide case studies, both ancient and modern. So I'm going to continue to edit that book series and see see what the future brings.
Now that we are also talking to young people and uh, starting students, what is the best advice that you can give these young people who want to study anthropology and mythology?
For young people who want to study anthropology and mythology, good for you. I can't think of a more sort of informative for me, a more informative study that really opened up philosophically how I could consider how I wanted to live my life, and I could view my culture and my home culture in a sort of dispassionate lens, right? And I could say, oh, that's why I was raised to think this way. That's why I was raised to think that way. These people do it that way. These people do it that way. And then you can sort of think like which part you like, which part you don't like, and pick and choose. And so I think that it's also beyond giving me a career and giving me something to really focus and research on. It's also just giving me a tremendous amount of self-awareness, I guess, and self-knowledge, and that gives you an individual the power to choose, the life that you want to construct for yourself, and to be able to understand the vast realms of human potential by studying other cultures, particularly other languages, other ways of other mythologies, other ways of thinking about the world. And I think we need this. I think we dreadfully, drastically need this. And again, why I'm saying that most emphatically is because of the environmental crisis. The environmental crisis is, yes, it's caused by mankind, but it's not caused by indigenous groups. And it's not caused, but it's caused by the dominant Western capital and capitalism in general, that is, ruining life on Earth at a very, very quick rate. So I think it's very necessary, increasingly necessary, to understand other cultures and reflectively understand our own. How did we get into this mess? And to understand how to get out. So, I think it's anthropology and mythology are very enriching topics, personally and socially. I think there's an urgency to their study as well, a huge urgency that I think they really are necessary to become more aware of and to research more and to get the word out more as part and parcel of saving life on Earth.
Professor Thompson, I see that the hour is almost over. And I'd like to thank you for this amazing opportunity to talk with you. But before we close out, can you tell us where we can find more information about your research, your books, and perhaps where people can ask you questions if they still have?
Um, you can just Google me. Google seems to work pretty well. I've got my homepage at the University of Southern California. I'm available via my email, which is listed there. And you can check out my books, the both the posthuman folklore, which showcases a lot of my recent own sort of casework and my own sort of research, as well as the Truth of Myth, co-authored with Gregory Schremp. that seeks to sort of give a good overview of the study of world mythology, how one can study it, how people have, and all the rest of that. And yes, and then I'm available. Email always works the best. And again, you can always find me at the University of Southern California Department of Anthropology website.
Thank you all for tuning in this week on The Next Truth, where science and myth meet. Make sure to visit our website, www.nexttruth.com. That is nexttruth, all in one word.com. And let us know what you think about our podcast. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we would appreciate a rating on our website in the section The Next Truth Podcasts. Or if you would simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us too. I am Maria Anna van Driel with The Next Truth. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.